close your eyes for a moment. Not yet, not fully. Just let them soften. Let the world at the edges of your vision blur a little. Let the sounds around you pull back, becoming background, becoming texture, becoming white noise under the quieter, more interesting thing happening right now. Something is looking outward. Something is aware of the darkness at the edges of your sight. Something is registering the weight of your body, the temperature of the air on your skin, the sound of your own breathing. Something knows that it is you. Not just a body in a room, but a self, a you, experiencing this particular moment in this particular place. That something is the most ordinary thing in the universe, and the most mysterious. You are conscious. You are aware. And despite thousands of years of philosophy, centuries of science, decades of neuroscience, and millions of pages of research, no one, not a single human being on Earth, can tell you exactly what that means, why it exists, or how it happens. Tonight, we are going to travel together through that mystery. We are going to walk back through time, all the way to the earliest moments when human beings first stopped, looked inward, and asked the strangest question any creature has ever asked itself. What am I? We will visit ancient river valleys where priests and scribes tried to write the soul onto clay tablets. We will sit in the marble courtyards of Athens where philosophers argued about the mind with the same intensity that sports fans argue about championship games. We will follow the story forward through the Middle Ages, through the Renaissance, through the great explosion of modern science, through the strange and troubled world of Sigmund Freud's Vienna, and all the way to the laboratories of the 21st century, where brilliant researchers are using technology that would seem like magic to every person we will meet tonight, and still finding that the central mystery holds. Consciousness, awareness, the inner life, the self, the human mystery we still don't understand. If you drift off at some point during this journey, and you may, because that is exactly what this is for, do not worry. The story will be here when you wake. Or perhaps fragments of it will drift down into your dreams, and you will find yourself wandering the streets of ancient Athens, or sitting in a quiet library in 17th century France, or looking through a microscope in a Victorian laboratory. That would be quite fitting. Whether you stay with me all the way to the end, or whether sleep finds you somewhere in the middle chapters, the journey is the thing. The gentle motion of moving through ideas, through centuries, through questions that have no final answer but carry enormous beauty in the asking. Let yourself get comfortable now. Let the space around you soften. Take one slow breath. And let's begin. Here is a question that seems simple until you think about it for more than a few seconds. When did humans first become conscious? And then, a harder version of the same question. When did humans first become aware that they were conscious? These are not the same thing. A dog chasing a ball is almost certainly experiencing something. There is sensation, perception, desire, joy. But it seems unlikely, though we cannot be certain, that the dog stops mid-chase and thinks, "What is this experience I am having? Why am I the particular dog who is having it? What does it mean that I exist?" Humans do this. Humans have been doing this for a very long time. The earliest physical evidence that human beings had some concept of an inner world, some sense that there was a self worth marking, worth preserving, worth paying attention to, comes from deep inside caves in southern France and northern Spain. The Lascaux cave system in the Dordogne region of France contains paintings that are approximately 17,000 years old. You have perhaps seen photographs of them, the bulls and horses and deer rendered in ochre and charcoal with a skill and grace that has left every artist who has studied them slightly humbled. But there is something else in those caves that gets less attention than the animals. Handprints. Hundreds of them, across sites in France and Spain and Indonesia and Australia and Argentina. A human being pressed their hand against the stone wall, blew pigment around it, and left the outline there in the dark. Scholars have studied these handprints at great length. They have analyzed the pigments, measured the proportions, tried to understand what ritual purpose they might have served. But there is something that no analysis can quite contain. Someone left proof that they were there. Someone said, in the only language available to them, "Here. A hand. My hand. I was here." That is, at its most basic level, what consciousness does. It creates a here. A me. A sense of being this particular thing in this particular moment, distinct from the stone and the fire and the darkness. Archaeologist Francesco D'Erico has spent decades studying the cognitive abilities of early humans, and his work suggests that the capacity for symbolic thought, for representing something abstract, like a self, through a physical mark, may have emerged gradually over hundreds of thousands of years. It was not a single switch that flipped. It was more like a slow brightening. The dawn of self-awareness was not a moment. It was a long morning. Consider what a handprint on a cave wall actually requires. It requires an understanding that you have a hand. That the hand is yours. That you and the cave wall are separate things. That future people who are not you, will see this mark and understand something from it. That the act of making a mark is meaningful. That you, the mark maker, are meaningful. That is an enormous amount of self-awareness packed into one gesture. And yet, for most of human evolution, we had no words for any of it. Language itself is thought to have developed into something close to its modern form somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago, though the exact timeline is something scholars continue to debate. Before language, any awareness a human being had of their own inner life was simply experience, sensation, emotion, thought, without the tools to name it, examine it, share it, or build on it. Language changed everything. When you have a word for grief, you can compare your grief with someone else's. You can describe what grief feels like and where in your body you feel it and how long it lasts. You can ask, do you feel this too? Is your grief the same as mine? And from those questions, you begin to build a shared understanding of what inner life is, what the inside of a person is like. Think about that process unfolding over tens of thousands of years. Think about all the conversations, around all the fires, in all the languages, across all the continents. Slowly, the inner world became a subject. Became something that could be pointed at and named and argued over and wondered about. By the time the first civilizations arose in Mesopotamia and Egypt, around 5,000 years ago, human beings had been wondering about their inner lives for a very long time. They arrived at the project of writing with already complex ideas about the self, the soul, dreams, death, and what might lie beyond the body. We will get to those first written attempts to understand consciousness in just a moment. But before we move on, let yourself rest with this image for a little while. A cave, firelight, a person, someone who might have been your ancestor in the most literal biological sense, pressing their hand against cold stone. Breathing out through a hollow bone. Watching the image of their hand appear in the darkness, red and clear and real. What were they thinking in that moment? Were they afraid of the dark beyond the fire? Were they satisfied? Were they awestruck by what they had made? Did they feel, in some wordless way, a sense of, I exist. I was here. This moment was real. Let those questions drift. Let them settle. There is no hurry tonight. Here is where it gets interesting. When the first human civilizations developed writing, somewhere around 3200 BCE in ancient Sumer, in what is now southern Iraq, one of the first things they wrote about was the inner life. Not just trade records. Not just lists of grain and livestock, though there were certainly plenty of those. They wrote about dreams. They wrote about the soul. They wrote about what happens when a person dies and where the self goes when the body stops working. This tells us something important. The question of consciousness, of what we are, inside, was not something that arose later in human history as a luxury of civilization. It was urgent from the very beginning. It was one of the first things people felt compelled to write down when writing became available. In ancient Sumerian belief, a human being had several distinct components. There was the physical body, obviously. But there was also something called the nam, a concept that scholars translate roughly as fate or essence, but which carried the sense of what a person fundamentally was. And there was the Z, which referred to life and breath and something like the animating principle of a person, what made you you rather than simply a collection of clay and water. When you died, the Z departed, and it descended, in Sumerian cosmology, into the underworld, a grim, dusty place called the core, where the dead drank muddy water and existed in a kind of pale, diminished version of life. The self survived death, but it survived badly. What is remarkable about this is not the specific belief, Every civilization has developed its own geography of the afterlife, but the underlying question it reveals. The Sumerians were asking, is the self the same as the body? Or is it something separate, something that can be detached from flesh and bone and sent elsewhere? That question has never gone away. We are still asking it tonight. Ancient Egypt developed an even more elaborate internal architecture for the human person. In Egyptian thought, you were not one thing. You were many things braided together. There was the Khat, your physical body, the thing you could see and touch. There was the Ka, often described as a kind of life force or vital energy, something like your double, which lived with you during your life and needed to be fed after your death, which is why Egyptians left offerings in tombs. There was the Ba, the closest the Egyptians came to our concept of the personality or individual self. The Ba was usually depicted as a bird with a human head, and it could leave the body during sleep and travel. After death, the Ba could move between the tomb and the wider world. And there was the Ak, the transfigured spirit, the form you became after death if everything went well, if the judges of the underworld weighed your heart against a feather and found it light enough. The heart. In Egyptian thought, the heart was the seat of consciousness. Not the brain. The heart was where you thought, where you felt, where you stored your memories and your moral record. The brain, according to many Egyptologists, was considered relatively unimportant. When Egyptians mummified their dead, they carefully preserved the heart. The brain was removed through the nose with a hook and discarded. Think about that for a moment. The organ we now consider the most important structure in the entire human body, the organ that generates every thought you have ever had, every memory, every emotion, every dream, was, to one of the greatest civilizations in human history, essentially garbage. This is not a sign of ignorance. It is a sign of how difficult the question is. How do you figure out where consciousness lives inside a body, using only your eyes and your hands and your reasoning? The heart is right there in the center of things, beating, warm, responsive to emotion. It beats faster when you are afraid, slower when you are at peace. It feels like the center. It announces itself as the center. The brain gives no such obvious signals. In ancient China, the philosophical tradition was asking its own versions of these questions at roughly the same time, though with characteristically different emphases. The early Chinese thinkers, those who would become associated with Confucianism and Taoism, were less interested in the anatomy of the soul and more interested in how the inner life related to the outer world. How should you live? What is the relationship between your inner state and your actions in society? How does the mind relate to virtue? The Tao Te Ching, attributed to the sage Laozi and thought to date from around the 6th century BCE, contains some of the most beautiful and disorienting early writing about the nature of awareness. The Tao, the way, is often described as what you find when you stop grasping for things, when you let thought settle like silt in still water, when the chattering surface of the mind becomes quiet enough to hear what is underneath. Knowing others is wisdom, Laozi wrote. Knowing yourself is enlightenment. This is not a therapeutic cliché, even if it has become one. In its original context, it is a radical claim. Self-knowledge, the ability to be aware of your own inner workings, is not just useful. It is the highest form of knowledge. It is what wisdom points toward. In ancient India, at roughly the same period, the Upanishads were being composed, texts of extraordinary depth that explored the relationship between the individual self and the underlying fabric of reality. The concept of Atman, the individual self or soul, and Brahman, the universal consciousness or ground of being, and the relationship between them, became one of the central philosophical obsessions of Indian thought for the next 2,500 years. The Upanishads ask, in their patient and meditative way, what are you really beneath the thoughts and the body and the story you tell about yourself? What remains when all of that is set aside? These are not simple questions. They are not questions that can be answered in an afternoon. They are the kind of questions you live with for a long time, maybe your whole life, and find that the living with them is itself a kind of answer. What strikes me, looking across all these ancient traditions, is how consistent the central puzzle is even as the answers diverge wildly. Every culture independently arrived at the same problem. There seems to be something it is like to be you. There seems to be an inside to human experience. And yet that inside is invisible, it cannot be weighed or measured, it disappears when you die, and no one can fully share it with anyone else. That problem has not been solved. It has only gotten more interesting. But before we follow it forward into the age of the Greeks, let yourself rest for a moment. Imagine a scribe in ancient Egypt, sitting in a small room near the Valley of the Kings, writing by lamplight. He is recording something about the Ba and the Ka, something about what happens to the self after death. His lamp flickers. He pauses. He looks up at the ceiling and considers, for just a moment, what it is like to be him. This particular person. In this particular room. With these particular thoughts. And then he dips his reed pen and continues writing. Something changed in ancient Greece, in the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era. It was not that the Greeks were the first to think about the mind. We have seen already that the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Chinese, the Indians were all grappling with these questions long before Socrates began asking inconvenient things in the Athenian marketplace. But the Greeks introduced something specific. They introduced a method. They introduced the idea that you could examine these questions systematically, step by step, using pure reasoning, without necessarily appealing to mythology or divine revelation. You could sit down, think carefully, build an argument, test it against other arguments, revise it, and come out the other side with something that was not just belief, but justified belief. This method changed everything. Socrates himself, who lived from approximately 469 to 399 BCE and who wrote nothing, leaving us entirely dependent on the accounts of his students, made self-knowledge the center of his entire life's work. His famous declaration, reported by Plato in the Apology, was, "The unexamined life is not worth living." By this he did not mean a life without travel or adventure. He meant a life in which you do not rigorously examine your own assumptions, your own beliefs, your own inner workings. Know thyself. The inscription above the oracle at Delphi. Socrates took it as his life's program. But it was his student Plato who built the first truly systematic theory of what the self actually is. Plato believed, and argued at great length, in texts of remarkable literary beauty, that the soul was the real you. The body was, at best, a temporary vehicle. At worst, it was a prison. The soul was eternal, immaterial, made of the same stuff as the timeless mathematical truths and perfect forms that Plato believed existed beyond the visible world. Here is Plato's argument, simplified enough for a quiet evening but not, I hope, oversimplified. He noticed that human beings seem to have access to ideas that are more perfect than anything in the physical world. We know what a perfect circle is, even though no perfect circle has ever existed in nature. We understand what justice means, even though no perfectly just action has ever been performed. We grasp beauty as a concept, even though every beautiful thing we encounter eventually fades. How do we have these ideas? Where did they come from? Plato's answer was that the soul existed before the body and had, in its pre-bodily existence, direct access to the realm of perfect forms. Birth, entering the body, caused a kind of forgetting. Learning, for Plato, was therefore not acquiring new information. It was remembering what the soul already knew. This is called the doctrine of recollection, and it is strange and beautiful and not entirely dismissed even by modern philosophers. There is something in it that resonates with a certain experience most people have had, the feeling that when you understand something deeply, you are not so much receiving new information from outside as recognizing something that, on some level, you already grasped. Plato divided the soul into 3 parts: reason, spirit, and appetite. Reason was the highest part, the part that could access truth, that could control the lower parts and direct a person toward the good life. Spirit was something like courage and emotion and the will to act. Appetite was the desires of the body, hunger, sexual desire, the wish for comfort and pleasure. A well-ordered person was one in which reason guided spirit and kept appetite in its proper place. A disordered person was one in which appetite ran riot, or in which spirit surged unguided by reason. This framework, this tripartite model of the mind, turned out to be astonishingly durable. You will find echoes of it in Freud's ID, ego, and superego. You will find it in modern discussions of emotional regulation and executive function. 2,400 years later, and we are still, in some ways, arguing within the structure Plato built. But then there was Aristotle. And Aristotle disagreed. Aristotle, who was Plato's student, and who eventually set up his own school, the Lyceum, in a grove of trees outside Athens, was in temperament almost the opposite of his teacher. Plato was a poet of the abstract. Aristotle was a cataloger of the concrete. He dissected animals. He classified plants. He observed the night sky and wrote down what he saw. He believed that knowledge began with the physical world, not with some separate realm of perfect forms. For Aristotle, the soul was not a separate thing from the body. The soul was the form of the body, the organization of the body, the way the body was structured and functioned. You could not separate the soul from the body any more than you could separate the sharpness from a knife. The sharpness was not a separate thing that sat inside the knife. It was a property of the knife. Similarly, Aristotle argued, the soul was not a separate thing that sat inside the body. It was a property of the body. This meant, of course, that when the body died, the soul ended too. There was no survival after death, or very little of it. This was a dark view in some ways. But Aristotle was not entirely certain. He allowed that the highest part of the mind, what he called the active intellect, might be something different, something that could potentially exist separately from the body. But he was vague about this, and scholars have argued about what he meant for 2,000 years. What Aristotle gave us, more than any particular theory about the soul, was the vocabulary for thinking about the mind. He distinguished between different kinds of thinking: perception, memory, imagination, reason. He noticed that animals and plants had a kind of soul, a life principle, too, but that human beings had a special form of soul that included rational thought. He described, with great care, how sensation works and how perception is not simply a passive recording of the world but an active interpretation of it. He was, in many ways, the first cognitive scientist. Here is something that might surprise you about this entire period. The debates between Plato and Aristotle, idealism versus materialism, the soul as something separate from the body versus the soul as the organization of the body, are not settled. They are not historical curiosities. They are exactly the debates that philosophers and neuroscientists are having right now, in the 21st century. When a neuroscientist argues that consciousness is simply what the brain does, that there is no ghost in the machine, no soul separate from the neurons, they are standing in Aristotle's tradition. When a philosopher argues that physical processes alone cannot explain the subjective quality of experience, that there must be something beyond the purely material, they are standing in Plato's tradition. 2,500 years of thinking, and we are still on the same ground, looking at the same mystery from slightly different angles. Let that settle quietly for a moment. The olive trees of ancient Athens are long gone, but the questions they shaded are still with us tonight. We tend, in Western histories of thought, to speak of the Middle Ages as a kind of pause. A long sleep between the brilliance of Greek philosophy and the awakening of the Renaissance. 1,000 years when the serious thinking stopped and people simply accepted what the church told them. This is not quite right. It is not even mostly right. What happened during the medieval period, roughly from the 5th century to the 15th century of the Common Era, was not that thinking about the mind stopped. It was that thinking about the mind moved almost entirely inside the framework of religious belief. And within that framework, some very interesting and sophisticated work was done. In the Christian tradition that dominated European thought during this period, the soul was not a philosophical abstraction. It was a theological certainty. Every human being had a soul, given by God, immortal, unique, capable of salvation or damnation. The nature of this soul, its relationship to the body, its fate after death, these were matters of enormous urgency, not academic curiosity. Saint Augustine of Hippo, writing in the late 4th and early 5th century, is one of the most fascinating figures in this entire history. He wrote something called the Confessions, which is not a confession in the modern sense, but a long, intimate, searching autobiography addressed directly to God. It is possibly the first great work of what we would now call psychological self-analysis. Augustine was, before his conversion to Christianity, a Manichaean, a member of a dualistic religion that believed the material world was fundamentally evil and the spiritual world good. He was also, by his own account, a man of powerful and unruly desires. The Confessions traces his struggle with those desires, his intellectual journey through various philosophies, and his eventual conversion. What makes Augustine remarkable in this context is how deeply, how honestly, how searchingly he examined his own inner life. He noticed the way memory works, not as a simple storage cabinet but as something active and creative and slightly unreliable. He noticed how desire can lead reason around by the nose. He was struck, as perhaps we all are on certain evenings, by the puzzle of time, how the present seems to exist only as a knife edge between past and future, and yet we experience it as solid and real. Our heart is restless, he wrote, in one of the most famous opening lines in the history of literature, until it rests in thee. That restlessness, that sense of something incomplete, something reaching, is Augustine's description of conscious human experience. We are, by our very nature, creatures of longing. And for Augustine, the object of that longing was God. The Muslim world of the medieval period was doing its own extraordinary work on these questions, and it would be a serious omission not to mention it. Ibn Sina, known in the Latin West as Avicenna, was a Persian philosopher and physician who lived from approximately 980 to 1037 C. He wrote a famous thought experiment called The Flying Man, which is remarkable for how much it anticipates later Western philosophy. Imagine, Ibn Sina says, that you have been created as an adult, fully formed, but floating in empty space. You cannot see anything. You cannot hear anything. You cannot feel anything, not even the weight of your own limbs. You have had no sensory experience whatsoever. In this condition, stripped of all sensation, all memory, all contact with the physical world, do you still know that you exist? Ibn Sina argued yes. You would still know that there is a self. There is something aware, even in total sensory deprivation, that it exists. And this awareness cannot be derived from the body, since the body has been deliberately removed from the thought experiment. Therefore, Ibn Sina concluded, the self, or the soul, must be something fundamentally distinct from the physical. This thought experiment is essentially the same as one of the most famous arguments in the history of Western philosophy, made by René Descartes some 6 centuries later. We will arrive at Descartes in the next chapter. Thomas Aquinas, the Dominican friar and theologian who lived from 1225 to 1274, attempted the enormous and ambitious project of reconciling Aristotle's philosophy with Christian theology. The result was a system of breathtaking intricacy and a view of the soul that tried to hold together the best of both traditions. For Aquinas, following Aristotle, the soul was the form of the body, not a separate ghost but the organizing principle of what you were. And yet, following Christian theology, this soul was also immortal, capable of survival after the death of the body. He believed that the intellect, the highest part of the soul, was not dependent on any particular physical organ and therefore could survive. Whether this synthesis fully works, whether you can have an Aristotelian soul and a Christian heaven at the same time without contradiction, is something that has kept theologians and philosophers busy ever since. And then there were the dreams. Medieval people thought a great deal about dreams. They were taken with great seriousness as potential messages from God or, more troublingly, from the devil. There were manuals for interpreting dreams, books that listed dream images and their supposed meanings, and the church had complex and contradictory views about which dreams were trustworthy and which were dangerous. But underneath the theological framework, there was real curiosity about what dreams actually were. Where did the images come from? Why did some dreams feel more real than waking life? Why did you sometimes dream about people you had not thought about in years? Why did some dreams seem to predict the future? These are not frivolous questions. They are versions of questions that occupy sleep researchers and neuroscientists right now. We will come back to them in Chapter 11. What the medieval period shows us, across the Christian, Islamic, and other traditions, is that the question of consciousness never really goes away. It shifts shape depending on the cultural context. It puts on different clothes. It speaks in different vocabularies. But the underlying wonder, the puzzlement at the fact that there is an inner world at all, persists. Rest with that for a moment. A monk in a stone cell by candlelight in the middle of the night, writing about the nature of the soul. Outside, a world that he believes was created by a conscious being who loves him. Inside his cell, his own consciousness, awake, aware, uncertain, reaching. The candle flickers. He writes another line. The winter of 1619 found René Descartes in a room in a village in Bavaria, warming himself by a stove. He was 23 years old, a French soldier and mathematician who had been traveling through Europe and had stopped, apparently, because of bad weather. He had nothing to do but think. And what he thought about over those long cold days changed the history of the human mind. Descartes was troubled by a fundamental problem. How do you know anything? How do you know that the world you experience is real, and not a dream? How do you know that your senses are giving you accurate information about reality, rather than systematically deceiving you? This might seem like an abstract philosophical game. But for Descartes, it was urgent. He was living in an era of enormous intellectual upheaval. Galileo had recently demonstrated that the Earth moves around the sun, overturning centuries of received wisdom. Everything that had been taken for granted seemed suddenly fragile. He wanted to find something solid, some bedrock of certainty, on which to build reliable knowledge. So he decided to doubt everything. Systematically. Radically. He would reject any belief that could possibly be false, and see what, if anything, was left. Could he doubt that the external world existed? Yes. His senses could be deceiving him. Could he doubt that his body existed? Yes, perhaps he was dreaming. Could he doubt that mathematical truths were real? Yes, perhaps some powerful evil demon was manipulating his mind, making 2 and 2 feel like 4 even though it was not. He doubted and doubted and doubted, stripping away everything he thought he knew, until he arrived at the one thing he could not doubt. The doubting itself. If he was doubting, he was thinking. And if he was thinking, he existed. A non-existent thing cannot think. The doubting proved the doubter. Cogito, ergo sum. Think, therefore I am. This is probably the most famous sentence in the history of philosophy. And it is worth sitting with carefully, because it says something very specific. It does not say, I have a body, therefore I am. It does not say, I can see the world, therefore I am. It says, I think. This thinking is happening. Whatever else might be uncertain, this much is real. Descartes concluded that the one thing he could be absolutely certain of was the existence of his own conscious mind. Everything else, his body, the external world, other people, mathematics, required additional justification. But the mind was self-evident. The mind proved itself by the very act of questioning. This put consciousness at the very center of philosophy. And it created a problem that we still have not solved. Descartes believed that the mind and the body were fundamentally different kinds of thing. The body was extended, it existed in space, it had dimensions and weight and could be measured. The mind was unextended, it existed nowhere in space, it had no dimensions, it could not be measured. They were different substances. This view is called substance dualism. And it raises an obvious and devastating question. If the mind and the body are such completely different kinds of thing, how do they interact? How does a thought, something non-physical, existing nowhere in space, cause your arm to move? How does a sensation, clearly physical, involving nerves and signals, produce a feeling, which is non-physical? How does the ghost talk to the machine? Descartes proposed, somewhat desperately, that the interaction happened in the pineal gland, a small structure at the base of the brain that he believed was uniquely suited to serve as the meeting point between body and soul. He chose it partly because it is one of the few brain structures that is not duplicated, there is only one of it, whereas most brain structures come in pairs, one in each hemisphere. This seemed to him like the kind of thing a unique, singular soul would need. We now know a great deal about the pineal gland. It produces melatonin. It helps regulate sleep. It is, in that sense, appropriately present in a story about rest. But it is not the home of the soul. The deeper problem Descartes raised, the problem of how mind and body interact, remains genuinely unsolved. This is not a trivial problem. It is considered by many philosophers to be one of the hardest problems in all of thought. Descartes also famously applied his method of doubt to other minds. He noted that, strictly speaking, he could only be certain of his own consciousness. When he looked out of his window and saw people walking in the street, how did he know they were not extremely sophisticated automata, mechanical beings going through the motions of life without any inner experience? His answer was language. Real human beings use language in a flexible, creative, open-ended way that no machine of his era could replicate. They respond appropriately to wildly different situations. They are not simply running pre-programmed responses. The creativity and flexibility of human language, he thought, pointed to a genuine inner life behind it. This argument, and the question it contains, has returned with enormous force in the age of artificial intelligence. We will meet it again later. For now, let Descartes sit by his warm stove in 17th century Bavaria. Let him stare into the fire and think about the thinking. Let the snow fall outside the window. Let the certainty of his own mind feel, for a moment, like the warmest and most astonishing thing in the world. Think, therefore I am. Say it to yourself quietly if you like, and rest. For most of human history, the relationship between the mind and the brain was unclear in the deepest possible way. People knew the brain was there. They could see it when they cut open a skull. But what it did, what its purpose was genuinely puzzling. We have already seen that the ancient Egyptians thought the brain was unimportant. Aristotle himself believed that the heart was the seat of thought and sensation, and that the brain's main function was to cool the blood. Even Galen, the great Roman physician of the 2nd century who dominated Western medicine for over 1,000 years, thought the seat of sensation was in the nerves and their fluid, not in the brain tissue itself. It was not until the 19th century that the relationship between specific brain structures and specific mental functions began to be understood clearly. And the story of how that understanding was reached is one of the strangest and most human stories in all of science. It begins, in part, with accidents. In 1848, a railroad worker in Vermont named Phineas Gage was tamping explosive powder into a borehole when the powder ignited. The tamping iron, a rod about 3.5 feet long and 1.25 inches in diameter, was propelled upward through the left side of Gage's face, passing behind his left eye, through the front of his skull, and out through the top of his head. Phineas Gage survived. He walked. He talked. He was, by the physical measures available at the time, largely intact. His physician, John Harlow, reported with amazement that his patient had recovered remarkably well. But something had changed. The people who knew Gage before the accident said that he was no longer himself. He had been, before the injury, a reliable, responsible, well-liked man. After the accident, he became fitful, irreverent, sometimes profane, unable to stick to any plan, prone to impulsive decisions. His friends said he was no longer Gage. The precise nature of the changes in Gage's personality have been debated and re-examined many times since, and it is now thought that some of the earliest accounts exaggerated his transformation. But the basic insight that the case provided was revolutionary. A physical injury to the brain had changed a personality. Had changed, in some important sense, who a person was. Personality, self, could be altered by damaging a piece of meat. What did that say about the soul? At roughly the same period, a French physician named Paul Broca was working with a patient who could understand speech perfectly well but could produce almost none. When asked to speak, the patient could only produce a single syllable, tan. Everything he wanted to say came out as tan. After the patient died, Broca examined his brain and found a specific area of damage, a region in the left frontal lobe. He named this region and proposed that it was specifically responsible for the production of speech. This was a landmark moment. Not because Broca was necessarily right in every detail. The neuroscience of language has become enormously more complex since his time, but because it established the principle of localization. Different parts of the brain do different things. The mind has geography. It has neighborhoods. A German neurologist named Karl Wernicke soon discovered a different area, also in the left hemisphere, that when damaged produced a different kind of language problem, The person could produce fluent speech, but it made no sense. They spoke in word salads, stringing words together with normal rhythm and grammar but no meaning. So there was one area for producing speech and another area for producing meaningful speech. The mind was not a single undifferentiated thing. It was a system with parts, and the parts could be separated. This was both illuminating and troubling. Illuminating because it suggested that the mind could, in principle, be understood, mapped, studied, explained. Troubling because it raised the question of where, in all of this brain geography, you were supposed to find the self. The unified, continuous sense of being someone in particular. If the mind was just a collection of systems, each doing its own job, what produced the feeling of being one coherent person? Hermann von Helmholtz, the great German polymath of the 19th century, contributed a crucial idea, that perception is not passive. When you see something, you are not simply receiving a picture of the world. Your brain is making an inference, a best guess, based on incomplete information. You are, in a very real sense, constructing your experience of reality rather than simply receiving it. This idea, unconscious inference, Helmholtz called it, turned out to be extraordinarily important. It suggested that much of what makes you you is not the raw data coming in from your senses, but the interpretations your brain imposes on that data. The self is, in some sense, a story your brain tells about the information it receives. We will come back to this idea. For now, imagine the Victorian laboratory again. The anatomist at his microscope, staining thin slices of brain tissue with dye, watching the shapes of cells emerge through the brass eyepiece. He does not know what he is looking at. He knows it is important. He suspects, but cannot yet prove, that the answer to the oldest human question might lie here, in this gray tissue, in these cells and their intricate connections. The answer has not yet been found. But the tools are finally being built. Sigmund Freud was not the first person to propose that there was more going on in the mind than the mind was aware of. Philosophers and physicians had been circling this idea for decades before his name became attached to it. But Freud was the one who built it into a system. And the system, whatever its scientific flaws, and it has many, changed forever the way we talk about what happens inside a human being. Freud trained as a neurologist in Vienna in the 1880s and 1890s. He was interested, at first, in the physical basis of mental illness, in finding organic, biological explanations for conditions like hysteria, anxiety, and obsession. But the patients he saw did not seem to respond well to purely physical treatments. And their symptoms often seemed tied to things in their personal histories, to memories and experiences and relationships. He began, with his colleague Joseph Breuer, to use a technique that became the foundation of psychoanalysis, asking patients to talk, to say whatever came into their minds, without censoring or editing, to follow the thread of their thoughts wherever it led. What he found surprised him. Patients would circle around certain memories, certain images, certain topics, and then veer away. They would go blank. They would forget what they had been about to say. They would fall silent or switch topics abruptly, in ways that seemed to have a logic even when they denied any awareness of that logic. Freud interpreted this as evidence of something he called repression, the mind's tendency to push certain painful, disturbing, or unacceptable material out of awareness, into the unconscious. The unconscious, as Freud envisioned it, was not simply the part of the mind that was currently inactive, the things you were not thinking about right now. It was a dynamic, active region, full of desires and memories and conflicts that had been pushed below the surface precisely because they were too troubling to confront. And these unconscious contents, he argued, were not passive. They shaped behavior, they caused symptoms, they appeared in dreams. Dreams, for Freud, were the royal road to the unconscious. His major work, The Interpretation of Dreams, published in 1900, argued that dreams were the disguised fulfillment of unconscious wishes. The dreaming mind did not simply replay the day's events or generate random imagery. It was working through the material that had been repressed, but it did so in disguise, through symbols and displacements and condensations, because even in sleep the mind's censoring tendencies were partially at work. You can see immediately why this view of consciousness is so striking. It says that the part of your mind you have access to, your conscious awareness, the thoughts you know you are having, is only a fraction of what is going on. Beneath it, a vast amount of processing, desiring, fearing, and remembering is happening without your knowledge. You are, in a sense, not fully acquainted with yourself. Freud divided the mind into 3 regions. The ID was the oldest, most primitive part, a seething reservoir of instincts and drives, operating entirely on what he called the pleasure principle: get what you want, now, regardless of consequences. The ego was the rational, reality-oriented part, the part that navigates the actual world, that plans and reasons and defers gratification. The superego was the internalized voice of social rules and moral demands, often experienced as guilt or shame. You can see the echoes of Plato here: reason, spirit, and appetite, recast in late 19th century Viennese terms. Freud's model has been extensively criticized. Many of his specific claims about the Oedipus complex, about female sexuality, about the causes of specific neuroses, have not been supported by subsequent research. His case studies were sometimes manipulated to fit his theories. His method of interpretation was circular in ways that made it difficult to test or falsify. But certain things Freud got right, or close enough to right that they matter. The idea that unconscious processing is real and important is now thoroughly established by cognitive science and neuroscience. We know that enormous amounts of information processing occur below the threshold of conscious awareness, that your brain is making decisions and forming judgments and constructing your experience before your conscious self is aware of any of it. This is not Freud's unconscious exactly, but it rhymes with it. The idea that early experience shapes adult mental life is also strongly supported by research in developmental psychology and attachment theory. The idea that self-examination, talking about your inner life, trying to understand your own patterns and histories, can be therapeutically valuable is the basis of the psychotherapy that hundreds of millions of people have found helpful. What Freud did, above all, was to take the inner life with enormous seriousness. He insisted that the life of the mind, its conflicts, its desires, its defenses and maneuvers, was a legitimate subject of study, worthy of as much attention and rigor as the physical world. He insisted that every symptom had meaning, every dream had significance, every slip of the tongue was not accidental. Whether he was right about the specific meanings, that is another question. But the seriousness of the attention itself was something. Imagine his consulting room in Vienna. A patient lies on the couch, eyes closed, talking. The city outside goes about its business. Inside this room, the patient is trying to find words for things that have never had words before. Trying to name the shapes in the dark. Freud listens, occasionally murmuring, occasionally asking a question. The clock ticks. The unconscious watches from below. By the early 20th century, there was a growing frustration among certain scientists. The study of the mind, consciousness, inner experience, introspection, seemed to be going nowhere useful. Philosophers were still arguing about the same questions they had been arguing about since Athens. Freud's methods were impossible to verify experimentally. The whole enterprise seemed soft, unscientific, and ultimately untrustworthy. A psychologist named John B. Watson decided that the solution was radical. In a famous 1913 paper called Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It, Watson argued that the proper subject of psychology was not the mind, not consciousness, not inner experience, because these things were invisible and therefore impossible to study objectively. The proper subject of psychology was behavior. Measurable, observable, recordable behavior. What organisms do, not what they experience. Conscious experience, Watson declared, was off the table. It could not be measured, therefore it could not be studied, therefore it was not science. Mental states were, at best, epiphenomena, like the shadow a train casts, going along for the ride but not causing anything. What caused behavior was stimuli, inputs from the environment, and the responses they produced. Psychology should study the relationship between stimulus and response and nothing else. This movement became known as behaviorism, and for several decades it dominated psychology in America and, to a lesser extent, in Europe. Its achievements were real. The study of learning, How organisms acquire new behaviors, advanced enormously under the behaviorist framework. B.F. Skinner, who built on Watson's foundation and became the most prominent behaviorist of the mid-20th century, developed a sophisticated understanding of how reinforcement shapes behavior. His work has practical applications that survive to this day, in everything from clinical therapy to animal training to the design of habit-forming apps on your phone. But something was missing. Something enormous. Because behavior without inner experience is, in an important sense, not what we are trying to explain. When we ask what consciousness is, we are not asking why organisms behave the way they do. We are asking what it is like to be an organism. We are asking about the inside. Behaviorism was not just uninterested in the inside. It was actively hostile to it. The question of what it feels like to see a red sunset or to taste an apple or to hear a piece of music was not just unanswered, it was considered illegitimate. Not a proper scientific question at all. Think about how strange this is. An entire movement of scientists agreed to ignore the thing that is most obviously real about human experience, the fact that there is something it is like to be a human being, in order to study something easier to measure. The 20th century psychologist Nicholas Humphrey has a marvelous way of describing this. He points out that behavior, even very complex behavior, does not, by itself, tell you anything about consciousness. You can imagine a being that behaves exactly as a human being behaves, responding appropriately to every situation, passing every test of intelligence and social competence, and yet having no inner experience whatsoever. The philosophical zombie, philosophers call it. A being that walks and talks and acts like you but for whom there is nobody home. If that is conceivable, and many philosophers think it is, then behavior alone cannot be the whole story. There is something else we are trying to explain. And behaviorism, by decree, refused to look for it. The cracks appeared in the 1950s and 1960s. A linguist named Noam Chomsky published a devastating review of Skinner's book Verbal Behavior, arguing that the behaviorist framework was fundamentally inadequate to explain how human beings acquire and use language. Children learn language in ways that cannot be explained by simple stimulus and response. They generalize, they create novel sentences, they understand rules they have never been explicitly taught. There must be something inside. Some mental structure, some innate capacity, that shapes behavior from within. The black box could not remain black forever. And so the curtains, slowly, began to part. The cognitive revolution, the return of the mind as a legitimate scientific subject, happened gradually through the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. It did not announce itself with a single dramatic moment. It was more like water finding its way through stone. Several things fed into it at roughly the same time. There was the development of computers. This gave scientists a new metaphor and a new set of tools. The computer processed information, took inputs, transformed them according to rules, produced outputs. Was the brain something like that? Was the mind something like software running on the hardware of the brain? This comparison, the computational metaphor, turned out to be enormously productive, even if it has significant limitations. There was Noam Chomsky's linguistic work, which we have already touched on, suggesting that the human mind has innate structure that goes beyond anything that could have been learned from experience alone. There was the work of psychologists like George Miller, who in 1956 published a famous paper called The Magical Number 7, plus or minus 2, about the limits of working memory, the number of items you can hold in your conscious attention at once. This was cognitive science at its most concrete, measuring a specific property of human thought with precision. There was the work of Jean Piaget in developmental psychology, carefully mapping the stages through which children's thinking develops, showing that the way a child understands the world changes in systematic, predictable ways as they grow. Mind had structure, and that structure developed. And there was the growing field of neuropsychology, the study of patients with specific brain injuries, which was revealing with increasing sophistication how different mental functions mapped onto different brain systems. Split brain patients, people who had had the connection between their two brain hemispheres severed, exhibited astonishing dissociations between their left and right halves, as if they had, in some sense, two minds in one skull. The neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga, who studied split-brain patients for decades, described something he called the interpreter, a system in the left hemisphere that confabulates, that makes up explanations for behaviors that are actually caused by processes the person has no conscious access to. The interpreter tells a story about why we do what we do, even when that story is wrong. This is a humbling and fascinating discovery. It suggests that our sense of our own motivations, our feeling that we know why we do things, may be, at least partially, a post hoc narrative. A story told after the fact by a part of the brain whose job is to make sense of the rest. If that is true, and there is substantial evidence that it is, then self-knowledge is harder than it appears. The story you tell about yourself, the account you give of your own motivations and choices and inner life, may be a construction rather than a direct report. This does not mean that introspection is worthless. It means that it needs to be taken carefully, alongside other kinds of evidence. The philosopher Daniel Dennett has argued, controversially, that consciousness itself is something like this: a story the brain tells, a kind of user interface, a useful fiction generated by the brain to help organize behavior. On this view, there is no single place in the brain where consciousness lives, no theater where all the information comes together and is experienced by a central self. Instead, there is just processing, distributed, parallel, without a center, and what we call consciousness is a kind of narrative imposed on that processing after the fact. Not everyone agrees with Dennett. His view is considered by many philosophers to underestimate the reality of conscious experience. But the framework he offers, the idea that consciousness is something the brain generates, a kind of emergent property of complex processing, has been enormously influential. Gradually, through the second half of the 20th century, consciousness came back in from the cold. It became, once again, a legitimate scientific subject. Psychologists, neuroscientists, philosophers, and computer scientists began to collaborate in ways that would have seemed strange a generation earlier. The field now called cognitive science emerged, an interdisciplinary study of mind and intelligence that refused to stay within the boundaries of any single academic department. The questions were old, but the tools were new. And with new tools, new forms of astonishment became available. In 1995, a young Australian philosopher named David Chalmers gave a talk at a conference in Tucson, Arizona, that changed the conversation about consciousness permanently. He introduced a distinction that has become one of the most discussed ideas in contemporary philosophy and neuroscience. He called it the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problems, Chalmers said, were all the questions about how the brain processes information, integrates data from different senses, controls behavior, manages attention, generates reports about internal states. These were called easy not because they were simple, they are enormously complex, but because we can at least see, in principle, what kind of explanation would solve them. If we map the brain thoroughly enough, if we understand the information processing in enough detail, the easy problems will eventually be solved. But then there is the hard problem. Even if we had a complete explanation of how the brain processes information, even if we knew every neuron, every connection, every signal, that explanation would still not tell us why there is something it is like to see red. Why the experience of tasting sweetness has the particular quality it has. Why there is a feeling to being you, an inside, a subjective dimension, an experience, rather than just processing happening in the dark. The philosopher Thomas Nagel had pointed toward this problem in a 1974 paper with a famous title, "What is it like to be a bat?" Bats navigate by echolocation. They emit ultrasonic pulses and interpret the returning echoes. We can know everything about how echolocation works, physiologically and neurologically. But what is it like, from the inside, to experience the world through echolocation? What is the felt quality of bat perception? Nagel argued that we cannot know. Not because we lack information, but because subjective experience is, by its nature, available only from the inside. I can know everything about your brain state when you see red and still not know what red looks like to you. I can only know what red looks like to me. This gap between the physical and the experiential is what Chalmers named the hard problem. Consciousness has qualitative character. Philosophers call this qualia, the felt quality of experience. the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the particular taste of coffee, the way music feels when it resonates in exactly the right way on an evening when you are already halfway to tears. These qualities seem real. They seem to be the most real things there are, in the sense that they are what you are most directly acquainted with. And yet no account of physical processes seems to capture them. Chalmers distinguished between the concept of a philosophical zombie, a being physically identical to a human being but with no inner experience, and a real human being. The question is such a zombie conceivable? And if it is conceivable, what does that tell us about consciousness? Many philosophers and scientists think the hard problem is a genuine problem that requires new ideas. Some think it is a pseudo-problem, that our intuitions about the separateness of the physical and experiential are mistaken, and that a complete physical explanation will eventually close the gap. Some think it points toward radical revisions of our understanding of nature itself. One such radical revision is called panpsychism, the view that consciousness or something like it is a fundamental feature of reality, present even at the most basic levels of matter. Not that rocks have complex inner lives, but that there is some primitive form of experience or awareness woven into the fabric of the universe, and that human consciousness is a highly complex version of something that goes all the way down. This view, which sounds strange at first, has been defended by serious philosophers including Philip Goff and Galen Strawson. It has an ancient lineage. It resonates with certain strands of Leibniz's thought and with some Eastern philosophical traditions. And it has a certain appeal as a response to the hard problem. If experience is fundamental rather than something that somehow emerges from purely non-experiential physical processes, the explanatory gap closes. Another approach is integrated information theory, developed by the neuroscientist Giulio Tononi. He proposes that consciousness is identical to integrated information, a mathematical quantity that measures how much a system, as a whole, is more than the sum of its parts. A system is conscious to the degree that it integrates information in a way that cannot be fully captured by the sum of its components working separately. The brain is highly conscious because it is enormously integrated. A simple calculator is not conscious because it does very little integration. This approach has the appealing quality of being, at least in principle, measurable. There is also global workspace theory, developed by the cognitive scientist Bernard Bars and further developed by Stanislas Dehaene and others. This theory proposes that consciousness is what happens when information is broadcast widely across the brain, made available to a large number of processing systems simultaneously. Unconscious processing is local and encapsulated. Conscious processing is global and shared. You are conscious of something when it enters a kind of broadcasting network and becomes available to the whole brain. None of these theories has definitively solved the hard problem. Each of them takes us further into the mystery and gives us more precise tools for thinking about it. But the central puzzle remains. You are conscious. Something is happening inside you, right now, that has a quality to it, a felt dimension, an experience. The light through your eyelids, the warmth of the air, the weight of your body, the particular character of this quiet moment. No one can fully explain how that is happening. No one. Let that be not frightening but wonderful. You have been awake for all of this journey. Or perhaps you have not. Perhaps you drifted for a while and have only now returned. Either way, this chapter is about what happens when you close your eyes and let the day go. About the mysterious country you enter every night, and what science has learned about it. Sleep was, for most of human history, poorly understood. The Egyptians thought it was a kind of small death, the leaving the body for the night, as it would one day leave permanently. The Greeks identified sleep with Hypnos, the twin brother of Thanatos, the god of death. Medieval Europeans worried about what their dreams meant and who had sent them. The scientific study of sleep began in earnest in the 20th century, particularly after 1953, when two researchers in Chicago, Eugene Aserinsky and Nathaniel Kleitman, made a discovery that changed everything. They were studying the sleeping patterns of infants, watching the eyes move behind closed lids. They noticed that at certain points in the night, the eyes moved rapidly, darting back and forth, up and down, while at other times, the eyes were still. They called the active periods rapid eye movement sleep, or REM sleep. And they made a further discovery. When sleepers were woken during REM periods, they almost always reported that they had been dreaming. Wake them during non-REM periods, and the reports of dreaming were much less frequent. Dreams, it seemed, were concentrated in these REM periods. And REM sleep had a characteristic pattern. It appeared in cycles through the night, the cycles getting longer toward morning, which is why your most vivid dreams tend to occur just before waking. This discovery opened a new era of sleep science. What we now know about REM sleep is both rich and, in important ways, still mysterious. During REM sleep, your brain is highly active. In some respects, more active than during waking. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain associated with rational planning and executive control, is relatively quiet. But other areas, including those associated with emotion and memory, are very active. This helps explain why dreams are so often emotionally vivid, why they are often full of surprising emotional resonance, and why rational reflection is largely absent. You do not, typically, stop in the middle of a dream and think, wait, this doesn't make sense. This room was in one city a moment ago and is now somewhere else entirely. This person I'm talking to keeps changing their face. Why am I not finding this strange? You simply experience it. You are, in your dreaming, a pure experiencer, present, immersed, without the ability to step back and analyze. The analyzing part is mostly offline. The neuroscientist Matthew Walker, in his book Why We Sleep, argues that REM sleep and dreaming serve several important functions. Memory consolidation, the transfer of information from short-term to long-term storage, happens during sleep, including during REM sleep. But REM sleep does something more than store memories. It processes them emotionally. It seems to strip away some of the emotional charge from difficult memories, replaying them without the full chemical cocktail of stress hormones, so that the memory persists but its raw emotional impact softens. This may be why sleep is so important after trauma. And why, conversely, sleep deprivation tends to make emotional responses more extreme. Without adequate sleep, the emotional brain becomes hyperreactive, and the rational frontal cortex has less capacity to moderate it. Dreams also seem to do something creative. There are numerous historical accounts of significant creative breakthroughs occurring during dreams or the hypnagogic state, the threshold between waking and sleeping. Auguste Kekulé famously claimed to have dreamed of the ring structure of benzene. Paul McCartney has said that the melody of Yesterday came to him in a dream. Dmitri Mendeleev reportedly dreamed the arrangement of the periodic table. Whether these specific accounts are fully accurate is uncertain. What is clear is that the dreaming brain combines information in unusual ways, drawing connections that the waking analytical mind might not permit. Dream logic is associative and lateral and unbound by the usual constraints of plausibility. There is also, deeply embedded in the experience of dreaming, one of the most interesting versions of the consciousness problem. Dreams feel real. While you are in them, they feel as real as waking experience. Sometimes more real, more vivid, more present. The hallucination is complete. The world the dream constructs has exactly the same felt quality as the world you wake into. What does this tell us about waking experience? If the brain can generate a fully convincing, fully felt, fully present reality from inside, using only its own processing, then what reason do you have to think that waking life is more than another, more consistent, more consensually agreed upon construction? This is not a new question. Philosophers have asked it since at least Plato. Zhuangzi, the Chinese Taoist philosopher of the 4th century BC, wrote, "Now I do not know whether I was then a man dreaming I was a butterfly, or whether I am now a butterfly dreaming I am a man." The uncertainty is not resolved by waking. It just becomes less pressing. You are drifting now, perhaps. The chapters of this journey are settling into a kind of half-dream already, mixing with your own memories and images and feelings. This is as it should be. The night mind is a kind of consciousness too. Let it do its work. Here is a question that changes how you see almost everything around you. Who else is conscious? Not just who else is intelligent. Not just who else behaves in complex ways. Who else has an inside? Who else has something it is like to be them? The question matters because if consciousness exists in other creatures, And in what degree, then we have moral obligations that go far beyond what most human societies have historically recognized. Suffering, after all, requires an experiencer. Pain is not just tissue damage. It is felt. We begin with our closest relatives. Chimpanzees and other great apes pass the mirror self-recognition test, a standard measure of a certain kind of self-awareness. When a mark is placed on a chimpanzee's face and the chimpanzee is shown a mirror, it reaches up to touch the mark on its own face, not on the reflection. This indicates that the animal recognizes the reflection as itself. It has some concept of self. Elephants, dolphins, and even certain birds have also passed this test or variants of it. Crows and ravens have demonstrated a range of problem-solving abilities that point to sophisticated planning and even a rudimentary theory of mind, an understanding that other beings have their own perspectives and knowledge. But the animal that perhaps most strikingly disrupts our intuitions about consciousness is the octopus. The octopus is about as distantly related to us as it is possible to be while remaining an animal. Our common ancestor with the octopus lived about 750 million years ago, long before even the first fish. Octopuses and humans have evolved nervous systems completely independently. And yet octopuses show behavior that is, by any reasonable measure, astonishing. They learn by observation. They play. They have distinct personalities. They navigate complex mazes. They use tools. Individual octopuses have been documented in research settings appearing to show preferences, moods, even something like curiosity. They solve problems in ways that suggest not just conditioned response but genuine problem solving. Peter Godfrey Smith, the philosopher and diver who wrote a beautiful book called Other Minds, has argued that octopuses offer us a glimpse of an alien form of intelligence. A consciousness, perhaps, that evolved from a completely different starting point, that might be structured in a completely different way from mammalian consciousness, and that is therefore all the more valuable as evidence that mind and awareness are not uniquely human inventions. And then there is the question of plants. This requires some caution. There is currently a great deal of popular writing suggesting that plants have consciousness, can communicate, can feel. The scientific situation is more nuanced. Plants do respond to their environment in sophisticated ways. Some plants have been shown to produce chemical signals that travel through the air or through fungal networks in the soil, and nearby plants respond to those signals in ways that look, from the outside, like communication. But response to the environment is not the same as experience. A thermostat responds to temperature. A computer virus responds to the files it encounters. We do not typically attribute experience to them. Whether plant responses involve any kind of experience, any inside, is a genuinely open question, one that most researchers answer tentatively with no, but that a growing minority keeps alive. And then, of course, there is artificial intelligence. We are living through a moment that philosophers have imagined but never encountered before. Systems that produce language, apparently fluent, apparently contextually appropriate, apparently creative language, are now available to anyone with an internet connection. And with every advance in these systems comes the question, is there anything it is like to be this? The question is not simple. Current large language models, whatever else they are not straightforwardly conscious in the way that you are conscious. They do not have bodies, do not sleep, do not have continuous existence. Each conversation begins fresh. There is no evidence that they have qualia, the felt quality of experience, though they can describe qualia in great detail. But here is the honest answer: we do not have a reliable test for consciousness. We cannot definitively establish that another human being is conscious. We take it on faith, based on similarity to ourselves. If a being becomes sufficiently different from us, we lose even the comfort of that analogy. The philosopher Nick Bostrom has argued that, as AI systems become more complex, the question of their moral status will become urgent in a way that our current frameworks are not equipped to handle. The question of who deserves moral consideration, who can suffer, who can flourish, who has interests that matter, may expand in ways we have not yet seriously thought through. This is not a comfortable thought, but it is an important one. Consciousness, wherever it exists, wherever it lives, is something astonishing. It is the universe looking at itself. It is matter becoming aware of its own existence. And it seems to be more widespread than we imagined. We have traveled a long way tonight. From handprints on cave walls to Victorian anatomy laboratories, from Plato's academy to Freud's consulting room, from the behaviorist's stripped-down world to the cognitive revolution's return of the inner life. Now we arrive at the present, or close to it, as close as any traveler through ideas can come. The science of consciousness in the 21st century is remarkable for the quality of its tools. Functional magnetic resonance imaging (fMRI) allows researchers to watch the brain at work in real time, mapping which regions become active during different mental states with a resolution that would have seemed miraculous to earlier generations of researchers. Electroencephalography, e.g., records the electrical activity of the brain with millisecond precision. Transcranial magnetic stimulation allows researchers to temporarily disrupt the function of specific brain regions, providing a kind of reversible virtual lesion. These tools have produced extraordinary findings. One of the most striking is the discovery of the default mode network, a set of brain regions that become most active not when you are engaged in a demanding task, but when you are not. When you are daydreaming. When you are thinking about yourself, or about other people, or about the past and the future. The default mode network is active when you are doing apparently nothing, just being present with your own inner life. This discovery was initially puzzling. Why would the brain be most active when it is not doing anything in particular? Why does it cost so much energy to do nothing? The answer, researchers now believe, is that the default mode network is not doing nothing. It is doing something enormously important. It is constructing and maintaining your sense of self. It is simulating the social world, modeling other people, imagining possible futures, processing the past. It is, in a very real sense, the home of your inner life. This matters for consciousness because it suggests that the subjective sense of being someone, of having a continuous, stable self that persists through time, is an active construction, requiring ongoing neural work. The self is not a thing. It is a process, something that the brain is continuously doing. The neuroscientist Anil Seth has developed this idea into what he calls the controlled hallucination model of consciousness. He argues that all perception, not just dreaming, but waking perception too, is a form of controlled hallucination. The brain is not passively receiving information from the world. It is actively generating a model of the world, using incoming sensory data to update and correct that model, but always working from an internal construction rather than directly from reality. When the hallucination is consistent with sensory input, we call it perception. When it is not, we call it delusion or dream or illusion. Your conscious experience of this moment, the temperature of the air, the darkness behind your eyelids, the sounds around you, is a model your brain is generating. An interpretation, a best guess that happens to be highly accurate. The self, on this view, is the brain's model of itself. And like all models, it is not the thing it represents. It is a map, not the territory. There is something liberating about this view, even if it initially sounds disconcerting. The self that wakes up anxious, the self that carries old wounds and old narratives and old stories about what it is and what it cannot do, that self is a model. A model built from experience, from memory, from relationship, from culture. It is a model that can be updated. It can be revised. Current research in mindfulness and meditation is showing that long-term practitioners show measurable changes in the default mode network, reduced activity in certain self-referential processing, changes in how the boundary between self and world is constructed. People who meditate regularly often report a shift in the felt quality of selfhood, less solid, less defended, more permeable. Ancient contemplative traditions have been saying something like this for thousands of years. The Buddhist concept of an no-self suggests that what we call the self is a construction, a habit of perception, rather than a real and permanent thing. Modern neuroscience is arriving at a similar conclusion from a very different direction. The study of psychedelic compounds is also producing remarkable and, in some cases, clinically important findings. Compounds like psilocybin, the active ingredient in certain mushrooms used in indigenous ceremonial contexts for centuries, appear to temporarily decrease activity in the default mode network, leading to what many users describe as a dissolution of the ordinary sense of self. This experience, reported across cultures and centuries, is now being studied by researchers at Johns Hopkins, Imperial College London, and other institutions for its potential therapeutic effects on depression, addiction, and end-of-life anxiety. What is happening neurologically when someone reports a mystical experience of unity or a dissolution of the boundary between self and world? We are beginning to learn the answer. We are beginning to see, for the first time, the neural correlates of states that contemplative traditions have described for thousands of years. This is not a proof of any particular metaphysical claim, but it is a bridge being built between ancient wisdom and contemporary science. There is also the ongoing work on the neural correlates of consciousness, the specific brain activity patterns that are associated with conscious experience. Researchers like Christoph Koch and Francis Crick spent decades searching for these patterns. Koch, more recently, has collaborated with Giulio Tononi on the integrated information theory we discussed in Chapter 10, trying to build a mathematical framework that would allow consciousness to be measured in principle. The adversarial collaboration project, begun in 2019, brought together researchers from opposing theoretical camps, global workspace theory and integrated information theory, to design experiments that might distinguish between their predictions. This is science at its best, setting up tests that have the potential to prove you wrong. Results from these experiments are still being analyzed and debated, but the willingness to test, to stake the theories against each other in honest experiment, represents a maturity in consciousness science that was not always present. We are not at the end of this story. We may be at its beginning, in terms of what there is to discover, but we are further along than any previous generation of human beings has ever been. And the view from here is extraordinary. Let that sink in for a moment. For hundreds of thousands of years, a creature looked at a handprint on a cave wall and wondered what it was to be itself. Tonight, that creature, and you are that creature, the same creature, carrying those questions in your cells, has MRI machines and philosophy departments and meditation researchers and mathematicians of consciousness all working to illuminate what was dark for all of that time. The mystery has not been solved, but it has never been more beautifully studied. We have journeyed together through a very long time. We have walked with the people who left handprints in dark caves, who were trying, in the only way available to them, to say, "I was here. I existed. This moment was real." We have sat with the scribes of ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, who tried to write down what a person is, what the soul is, where it goes, why it matters. We have listened to Plato in his academy, making the case for the eternal mind. We have heard Aristotle counter that the mind is the form of the body, not a separate thing at all. We have followed the argument through the long, candlelit nights of the medieval period, through the monasteries and the libraries and the dream manuals and the philosophical disputes that looked like theology but were always, at their core, about the same question: what am I? What is this that looks out through my eyes? We have stood in René Descartes' warm room in 17th century Bavaria and felt the strange vertiginous clarity of his insight. Whatever else might be uncertain, the thinking is certain. The aware is real. We have walked through the Victorian laboratories, looking at brain slices through brass microscopes. We have lain on Freud's couch and let free association take us wherever it goes. We have watched behaviorism draw the curtains against the inner life and then, slowly, been there as those curtains were drawn back again. We have lived through the cognitive revolution and arrived at the hard problem, the mystery at the heart of all of it, the question that remains after all the neuroscience has been done. Why is there something it is like to be you? Why is there a felt quality to your experience? Why is the universe not dark all the way down? And we have looked at the frontiers, at the dream researchers and the meditation scientists and the psychedelic researchers and the theorists of integrated information, all trying to get closer to an answer, all finding that the closer you look, the more intricate the question becomes. Here is what all of this amounts to. You are the universe being aware of itself. At this moment, in this specific form, with this specific history and these specific thoughts, something that was not conscious for 13 billion years, hydrogen and helium and gravity and time, has organized itself in such a way that it knows it exists. It asks what it is. It lies in the dark and wonders. That has never stopped being astonishing. It was astonishing to Laozi in 6th century China. It was astonishing to Descartes by his stove in Bavaria. It is astonishing to the researchers staring at brain scans at 3 in the morning, trying to understand what they are looking at. And it is astonishing right now. Whatever the answer turns out to be, whether consciousness is fundamental to the universe, woven into its basic structure, or whether it is something that emerges from sufficiently complex physical processes, a miracle of organization rather than substance, either way, it is extraordinary. Either the universe contains within it, at its most basic level, a tendency toward experience, or it has, through billions of years of processes without intention or plan, produced beings capable of finding all of this wonderful. Both of those are, in their different ways, almost too much to take in. In 1990, the Voyager 1 spacecraft had traveled so far from Earth that the astronomer Carl Sagan requested that its camera be turned back toward the solar system for a final photograph. The resulting image, since named the pale blue, shows Earth as a tiny speck of light, barely visible, suspended in a beam of sunlight against the vastness of space. Sagan wrote about that photograph, and what he wrote is as relevant to tonight's journey as anything in the history of philosophy or neuroscience. Look again at that, he wrote. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. Every person who ever asked what consciousness is. Every person who ever lay in the dark and wondered what they were. Every philosopher, every scribe, every cave painter, every researcher, every child who ever looked in the mirror and found the looking astonishing. All of it happened on that pale blue dot. All of that wondering, on that small bright speck of rock and water and life. The mystery, the human mystery, is that the dot knows it exists. That the universe, in this small corner of itself, has become aware of itself. Has begun to ask about itself. Has found itself extraordinary. You are part of that. You're wondering, tonight, your half-asleep questions, your willingness to float through these ideas on your way to sleep, that is the universe being curious about itself. If you find this journey has stayed with you, if these ideas drift through your days and the days ahead, perhaps share it with someone who, like you, takes the nighttime seriously. Who understands that the moments before sleep are some of the most interesting moments of the day, because the usual noise has quieted and the deeper things have room to surface. And for now, you need do nothing at all. You have earned the rest that is coming. The long, warm, mysterious country of sleep, where your brain will process everything from this evening and from all the days before it, and will do things that are still not fully understood, consolidating, connecting, creating, healing. Let your breathing slow now. Let the ideas of this journey settle, like silt in still water. The questions will be there in the morning. They have been there for hundreds of thousands of years, and they will outlast all of us. For tonight they can wait. The candle flame flickers in the dark. Somewhere in southern France, deep inside a cave where no light has fallen for thousands of years, a handprint waits on a cold stone wall. The ochre pigment still holds its color. The hand was small. The person who made it stood exactly where you stand, in the middle of the mystery, with no complete answer, with only the awareness that they existed, that this moment was real, that the wondering itself was worth something. They did not solve the mystery. Neither have we. But we have kept it company, across all these centuries and all these chapters and all the long way from that cave to this quiet room where you are lying now. That is not nothing. That is, perhaps, everything. For tonight, let yourself rest. The universe has been aware of itself, through you, for a few more hours. It has traced its own outline through the hands of cave painters and the pens of scribes, through the marble corridors of Athens and the stone cells of medieval monasteries, through Descartes' warm room and Freud's dim office and the glowing screens of modern laboratories. And now it is resting. You are resting. Let your body grow heavy. Let the last thoughts of this evening drift upward and dissolve, the way smoke rises from a candle that has just been blown out, curling once, twice, and then simply becoming part of the air. The darkness is not empty. It never was. Good night.